Conversation on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. First, thanks to Thin Lee for keeping us going in all matters tech related. A few of our other hosts were not able to join today. Mary Texera, Professor Emerita of the Sociology Department. Also Matt Patino, who's instructor of history at Crafton Hills College, and Amber Broaden, who's instructor of history, instructor in psychology here at Cal State San Bernardino and also Cal State Dominguez Hills. It gives me great pleasure to welcome and to start a really great panel today, and I'll pass it over to Stan Futch of the West Side Action Group.
Thank you. I'd like to start by reading the CSUSB land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on territories and ancestral lands of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuhavatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since its institution founded in 1965. Consistent with our values, community, and diversity, we have responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indians and indigenous peoples. And then I'll pass it on to Michael German, who will introduce our guest. You're muted, Mike.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike German. Thank you, Stan. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice and a former FBI special agent. And it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Avila. He's an urban cultural historian studying the intersections of racial identity, urban space, and cultural representation in 20th century America. He's the current holder of the Waldo Neikirk Term Chair in Undergraduate Education at UCLA. He began his undergraduate education at UC Berkeley in 1986 and left that institution with a PhD in history in 1997. Studying U.S. cultural history under the supervision of Professor Lawrence Levine. Since 1997, he has taught Chicano Studies and History at UCLA and holds an affiliation with the Department of Urban Planning. He's the author of Popular Culture in the Age of White Flight, Fear and Fantasy in Suburban Los Angeles, published in 2006, and The Folklore of the Freeway, Race and Revolt in the Modernist City, published in 2014. For Oxford University's very short introduction series, he wrote American Cultural History, a very short introduction. Avila holds joint appointments as professor of Chicano Studies and Urban Planning at UCLA. Thank you very much, Eric. It's great to have you here, and tell us about your work and what you're looking at today.
Thank you. Well, thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation to join the conversation. Delighted to be here. First and foremost, I think I consider myself an urban historian of 20th century America, and I focus on Los Angeles. All of the work that I do in my teaching, my research, my writing is really focused on LA and the emergence of Los Angeles as an American city after the Mexican-American War of 1848. And that's been my kind of research interest, I think, ever since I was in undergraduate school. Many reasons why, but I'm very excited to be part of a vibrant community of urban historians in the United States. And I'm proud to have been a scholar who kind of brought Los Angeles, along with many other important scholars, into the conversation about American urban history. If you go through my work, you'll find that I'm really interested in cultural history. And by that, I mean the history of cultural representation and different forms of cultural representation, like art and literature and film and television, music, architecture. But as an urban historian, I'm interested in the relationship between culture and its development to the structure of cities, how communities are formed, transportation networks, political formations, political regimes, kind of the nuts and bolts of urban development through a wide variety of public policies and private practices. But my research is really focused on kind of that interchange between the cultural and the structural, and how it shaped the identity and the experience of cities like Los Angeles.
Can I'm as a historian, I'm so interested in this idea of cultural history, and I was really delighted to read the very short introduction. Can you talk a little bit more about, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds of a couple of historians talking about historiography and methods and that kind of thing, but about cultural history, particularly in your work, and how this idea, for example, of white flight and popular culture depictions of race in the in cities plays out in your research and your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess to answer that question, I'll go back to my first book, Popular Culture in the Age of White Flight. And, you know, the title of that book, I think, is meant to convey kind of what I said earlier about bringing questions of culture and cultural representations to questions of structure, particularly urban development. And I'm really interested in, for example, film. I'm very interested in film, and in that book, there's a chapter on film, a body of film that emerged in the late 1940s, 1950s. And that genre of film was known as film noir. And it was distinguished by a few things, by its focus on cities, American cities, its focus on crime and deviance, and its focus on kind of dark, unhappy endings, which was very atypical of the kind of classic Hollywood product. And there's a lot of scholarship on film noir that I was really influenced by and interested in, but I was really struck by the fact that no scholar had looked at film noir through the lens of urban history. So, in other words, no scholar kind of looked at this body of film and said, this is about cities at a moment in 20th century American history when cities were undergoing significant transformations. And by that, I mean things like suburbanization, highway construction, slum clearance, and urban renewal. And these were structural processes that were crafted at the federal level, implemented at the state and local level. And they were based upon ideas about slums and race and deviance that shaped the course of urban planning and urban practice in the mid-20th century. And as far as I know, I was the first scholar to kind of look at film noir alongside these policy changes that shaped urban development and that promoted the development of racially homogeneous suburbs and created a basis for the formation of what became concentrations of racial poverty, otherwise known as the ghetto, or in the context of Los Angeles, the barrio. And to me, bringing all of that together, I began to realize that there's another way of understanding film noir, besides the content of the film, besides the imagery or the thematic imagery of the film, and that is to look at what was actually happening in cities. And so I kind of concluded that film noir ultimately became kind of a white suburban way of looking at cities that were being left behind in the wake of highway construction and suburbanization. Cities are dangerous, cities are black, cities are poor and deviant. And the suburbs afforded an opportunity to resurrect a kind of idealist image of the white nuclear family. And that was another body of cultural work that surfaced on television, also in film, and surfaced at places like Disneyland, which was another chapter of that book. It's a very long-winded answer to your question, Jeremy. I'm sorry, but in that way, I try to bring together questions of culture to issues around structure and policy.
Thank you. That's where I have a question. Just fits that right in that realm. It's Rialto, California, where I live, built a freeway, and in building the freeway, they did not make off ramps into the black neighborhood. Also, Palm Springs, there's a city called Cathedral City, and one of the things that they did is they didn't put any gas stations in their town. And they did that for purposes of not having people, regular people, outsiders, stop in their city. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, these are all ways of maintaining or enforcing certain patterns of exclusion, certain patterns of containment, particularly in the effort to contain racial poverty in cities. The best example that I can think of in Southern California is East Los Angeles and the neighborhood of Boyle Heights. But if you ever look at a map of East LA, the concentration of Mexican American working class poverty is contained within a very, very clear set of concrete boundaries. And those concrete boundaries were the freeways that were built during the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. And if you look at a map of East Los Angeles, I mean, you can clearly see how the freeways isolate, segregate, separate, divide Mexican American poverty from the rest of the city. And that was a pattern that played out all over Southern California. And it wasn't just freeways. I mean, you could go back to the 19th century and think about railroads. So I was born in the town of Redlands. And my family were all from the northern side of the 10 freeway and what used to be the railroad tracks that later became the path of the 10 freeway. And my family is from the northern side of the tracks or the freeway, which is where Black and brown communities were segregated from the white communities on the south side of the 10 freeway and earlier the railroad tracks, right? So those lines of transit or transportation became de facto barriers that enforced racial segregation. On the one hand, Black and brown, working class, poverty, and on the other hand, more middle class or affluent communities in the south side of Redlands, especially in the hills. And that's not just done through roads and freeways and railroads, but through other forms of infrastructure, such as gas stations in Coachella Valley or the Inland Empire. So these are all ways in which the built environment is shaped in a way that reinforces racial divides. And to me, what's crazy is, those racial divides are really just a figment of our imaginations. we have this idea that race is something real, and that, you know, Black people or brown people are somehow genetically different from white people. That's a story that we tell ourselves. And that's where we get into the terrain of cultural history, because cultural history is essentially the history of stories, right? Film, novels, um, um, television, music, those are all stories that we tell ourselves. And race is also a story. And culture is very important in maintaining the story or the fiction of race. And culture is also very important in resisting or subverting the story or the fiction or the imagination of race. But where it becomes real is when we start designing our cities in such a way to reinforce those stories or those ideas about difference and racial difference in particular. Sorry, again, another long-winded answer to your question, but
No,
you guys are asking tough questions, so I'm going to.
I'm fascinated by your answers. So thank you very much. And if you don't mind me interrupting, Stan.
Go
Uh,
ahead.
and I'm also, I really like the reference to film noir, and I think ties into this very well, as you suggest. And I was a big fan of film noir, you know, particularly because a lot of the protagonists were detectives, right?
Yeah.
And were law enforcement or vigilante victims who were finding justice through their own methods. And it was often a particular type of law enforcement that was very violent, bending or breaking the rules, hard drinking, and you know how much of that played out in reality, where you know in addition to the infrastructure containment methods, that one of the other containment methods in segregating these communities was the police, and you know how the police role changed as this white flight phenomenon was taking place, or did it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's a sub genre within film noir that focuses on like police and detective work. And there's a lot of examples of film noir that, you know, focus on like one deviant character, a murderer, a robber. Um, and then the film unfolds by, you know, the careful, methodical work of police detectives and officers trying to identify the killer, the murderer, what the robber, whatever. But it's all about the hunt, the chase. And that inherited traditions from literature like Raymond Chandler in the 1930s, or James Cain in the 30s. And that's also what led to, you know, popular television series like Dragnet, and then, you know, shows in the 70s like SWAT or Chips or, you know, whatever. But yeah, that's always been an important aspect of 20th century American popular culture is, you know, portraying the police, portraying law enforcement as the good guys. And it's always this good guys versus bad guys narrative, with some really brilliant exceptions to that rule. But you know, film noir often sided with law enforcement, and you know, used the city as kind of the appropriately kind of seedy, degenerate, dangerous milieu where, you know, criminality and deviance took shape.
In early Los Angeles, they had the Goon Squad, and they arrested those five Hispanic individuals for a murder, and they knew they weren't guilty, but that was who they wanted to show as being the bad people. And these poor five guys were beat up and abused and so on, even though they knew that they weren't guilty of this attack.
Yeah,
Um,
I think you're referring, Stan, to the Sleepy Lagoon incident and trial. Is
I
that?
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a incident of gang violence in 1942 in South LA, and the body of a young Mexican American man was found, and there was no evidence about, who committed this crime. But the police went in there and began apprehending individuals and began arresting and imprisoning individuals without due process and without any evidence of a crime. And that led to a very infamous court trial. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of literature on the LAPD and LAPD history. I haven't really contributed to that literature, but some of my colleagues are former graduate students have looked at the history of the LAPD with really rigorous and in-depth scholarship.
I just recently watched a movie. It's called The Banker. I don't know if you've seen that movie. It's
Oh,
two African American men that became millionaires by they wanted to do housing integration in Los
mhm,
Angeles.
mhm.
So they started buying up property in Los Angeles, but in order to buy the property, they had to have somebody that was of Anglo descent to actually put his name on it because they couldn't buy property. And so they did that. And one of the things that they did is they started buying properties in white neighborhoods and putting black families in them. And also what the interesting part of it was is when they started off and how they got rich is they would integrate just one apartment. They'd buy the building, integrate one apartment, and they knew for a fact that there would be white flight because of the black people moving into the building. And so when so they took advantage of the opposite of what we're talking about. They were putting blacks in communities to actually get white flight so they could make more money by selling buying more buildings and putting more blacks in and actually changing the conditions of the neighborhoods. Can you talk a little bit about that? How things changed?
Yeah, that was a typical pattern in mid-20th century America. It was called blockbusting. And usually the way it worked is yeah, white real estate agents would organize the sale of a property in a white neighborhood to a black family or a black individual, and then essentially kind of create a panic or induce anxiety about, quote unquote, blacks moving into the neighborhood. Um, and that led to a rapid sale of property that created more opportunities for real estate agents to sell to black families at inflated prices, and to force a shift in the real estate market from white to black. But that led to economic opportunities for white real estate agents. And to me, blockbusting, you have to think of it alongside things like homeowners associations, restrictive covenants, redlining, and other formal or informal practices that fostered racial segregation in mid-20th century America. And this became especially prominent, during the post-World War II suburban boom, which created this frontier for white flight, and led to the kind of racial resegregation of America in the 1950s.
There was a phenomena across the country where were called sundown towns. Were there sundown neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and how were those organized and arranged?
Yeah. To my mind, one of the most prominent sundown towns in the LA area was Glendale, which historically was a whites only neighborhood, and the term sundown town referred to, if you're a black and brown person in that neighborhood, you better get out before the sun sets, or you're going to be in trouble. It was part practice, it was part mythology, but it was a way of a warning to black and brown people that Glendale and many other Southern California communities were white neighborhoods. And it was meant to induce fear within Black and Brown people to be very, very careful about their presence in neighborhoods that were for whites only. So yeah, long history of that in SoCal, but there were many other examples throughout the country as well.
Right.
Yeah, I'm real familiar with a lot of the Black issues and the Green Book and so on, but I'm not real knowledgeable about the Hispanic community. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Mexican Americans, experienced similar forms of segregation, but what was different was the fact that some Mexican Americans had a presence in Southern California dating back several generations. Others were recent arrivals from Mexico, so it was a stratified and more complex community. Whereas most African Americans in Los Angeles shared a common history and geography coming from southern states and relocating to the far west to cities like Los Angeles and Oakland, for example. Wasn't the same for Mexican Americans, but Mexican Americans did experience their own forms of discrimination and segregation in the housing market, in the job market, in healthcare and education. And those circumstances or conditions is what led to the Chicano movement and Chicano activism in the late 1960s and 1970s. And that activism was partly inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement, but also inspired by a long history of discrimination against Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. But the best book to read, I think, in terms of this history is Carey McWilliams. He was a prolific author, sociologist, historian, and actually circling back to the Sleepy Lagoon trial, Carey McWilliams was one of the first presidents of the ACLU. And in that position, he was the lead attorney defending the young Mexican-American men who were apprehended without evidence for the alleged murder of Jose Diaz in the Sleepy Lagoon trial. But Carey McWilliams wrote a book about Southern California in the 1940s, and he talks about communities like Redlands and Fontana and Rancho Cucamonga and Rialto. And he talks about the de facto segregation of Mexicans, and he compares the Inland Empire to Southern style racial segregation between Black and white. But McWilliams was kind of the first to acknowledge that in SoCal, it was brown and white. But he made direct comparisons between Southern style racial segregation and a similar pattern implicating Mexican Americans in Southern California, Los Angeles, and the Inland Empire in particular.
Very, very much true, because that's where I live in the Inland Empire, and Fontana also was home to the KKK,
Yeah.
and so
So was Anaheim, and so was Glendale as well.
yes, and so they had roots in the area, and they added to the problems, or I should say problems. They added to the segregation of communities, and people were somewhat afraid to move into areas where they were strong. And Fontana was one of them, which was really a thriving city because of the steel, Kaiser Steel.
That's right.
And so as the city grew, Kaiser Steel got huge, and there was a lot of work there, and it was hard for Hispanics and African Americans to even get jobs in the factories until they needed bodies, and then, so of course then they started hiring them. But even on the job and so on, it was a dangerous place for minorities.
Yes, very true.
And I would add that the history of the Klan in the South being hand in glove with law enforcement was also the case here in California. and particularly with LAPD. And I want you to talk about kind of the definition of culture, because it's such a prominent part of our conversations today, where there's this argument that, well, certain kind of immigrants assimilate and others don't assimilate or can't assimilate in a way that imagines culture as very uniform and homogenous, when, especially in Los Angeles, it's never really been that way.
No, that's very true. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, the way I think about culture, the way that I teach the concept in my classes is I think about culture as the forms through which we express collective values, attitudes, beliefs, values, the way that we circulate, implement, teach values, attitudes, beliefs, it occurs through cultural forms. Again, coming back to the classic examples of literature, art, film, music, architecture. These forms of expression are ways that a society or a community expresses itself and its ideas about its place in the world, its identity. Culture is central to the definitions of identities, social identities, gender identities, racial identities, class identities. And we look to our culture to make sense of our social identities and our place in the world. It doesn't always work in one direction. Culture is multiple voices, multiple values, multiple attitudes and beliefs that often contradict each other. And that's one of the exciting things about studying culture, is that well, in my book, I think I put it by saying, culture is like war. It's politics by other means, right? And that's where I think the study of culture is so interesting, is that culture is used to enforce dominant social attitudes or dominant social beliefs, but culture is also used as a way of expressing resistance to dominant attitudes and dominant beliefs. So when you're studying the history of culture, within the context of race, for example, you're studying, on the one hand, the way in which racial hierarchy is communicated through cultural forms. But you're also studying the way in which racial hierarchies are subverted and resisted through other kinds of cultural forms that generate within particular communities. Culture also means, implicating the study of technology, the study of ownership. Who owns the technology? Who owns, what Marx would call the means of production, the means of cultural production, such as Hollywood film studios, or publishing companies, or museums and art galleries. I mean, these are repositories for dominant forms of cultural expressions that implicate, massive amounts of capital and investment. But on the other hand, within working class communities or poor communities, culture is still a vital resource for expressing resistance or subversion. And that's where I think the study of culture is so interesting, and really fun from a historical perspective.
I guess I'd ask whether you consider Spartacus film noir. I think that's a good example of art challenging existing systems. But of course, the system at the time then targeted the screenwriter.
Yeah, no, Spartacus is a really interesting example. I mean, I forget what year the movie came out, but I think it came out after the Watts Uprising of 1965. And this is a film about a slave uprising, right, in ancient Rome. But, for a historian to look at a film like Spartacus, I think the first question a historian would ask is, okay, when did this movie come out and what was happening at the time that this movie came out to contextualize a film like Spartacus? And when you try to answer that question, you realize, okay, here's a film about a slave revolt in ancient Rome that comes out in 1967. And in 1967, that was in the middle of what urban historians call the long hot summer, in which there were uprisings in inner city Black neighborhoods throughout the country. Watts in LA was the largest uprising in 1965, but there were hundreds of others all over the country in urban Black neighborhoods. And in the language of many of these uprisings, many people who participated likened them to slave revolts, right? So here's an important context for understanding a film like Spartacus. And that's how a cultural historian goes about his or her work, is by looking at the cultural expression, or what we call the text, right? The text could be a novel, it could be a film, it could be a television program, it could be a building, it could be a painting, but you move between the text and the context in order to understand historical meaning and historical significance, right? So that's how a cultural historian does the work of cultural history.
I'm glad Mike brought that up. That was one of my favorite movies for years. And the reason why it was one of my favorite movies for years is because there was a Black man in the movie who was of stature. And in movies, you didn't see too many Blacks in a strong role, and he was strong in that movie. Which leads me to my question, the media. Can you talk a little bit about the media and how it controls the how things are? In other words, like Spartacus was a reflection of what was going on at the time, how the media directs us either away or to what's happening today.
Big question. That's the kind of question that, you can teach an entire course on. I don't know that there's any easy answer to that question. I think I tend to hedge a little bit in saying that the media controls. The media disseminates, the media reflects, and the media reinforces, and the media provokes. But to say that it controls, I think, is a little bit extreme, because I think that, all individuals have the capacity to interpret the media critically, and to interpret the media through the lens of their own kind of subjective position or subjective experience in the world. Right now, I'm a little bit worried about the power of the media to influence public opinion and shape public opinion. But I do remain optimistic and confident that, ultimately at the end of the day, there's more of a dialogue than a one-way flow of information that is imposed upon, passive audiences. I think there's more of kind of a give and take, kind of active passive relationship between the consumers of media and the producers of media. And when we talk about media, we're talking about many, many things. We're talking about community-based newspapers, like the Sentinel, right, which is one of the oldest Black newspapers in Los Angeles, dating back to the early 20th century. And we're also talking about the Los Angeles Times or the Washington Post or the New York Times, or national, news outlets. And of course, the national news outlets have a much greater reach and a much greater power to shape opinion. But, for every Sentinel out there in American cities, there are community outlets for voicing resistance and for voicing difference. So I see more of a dialogue at play, more of a back and forth. when I think about the media. At least that's how I think about it.
Can I jump in about this one? I've just gotten the book and I'm looking forward to reading it, The Freeway, and thinking a little bit about the role of the freeway, particularly in Los Angeles, in terms of generating, I think, a lot of the post-war world that we may kind of look at and say, you know, thus has it ever been. But in your work, there's a sense that this was a deliberate transformation, obviously, in terms of the construction of the freeway and the impact that it had on the neighborhoods, on the racial makeup of the neighborhoods. And we talked a little bit about the intersection with cultural history and the city, depictions of the deviant city versus the virtuous suburb. Can you talk a little bit about how the freeways, particularly in Los Angeles, had an impact on this, the construction of the freeways, maybe in contrast to the context of a different city, an East Coast city, or Chicago, New York, something like that. Robert Moses and the ways in which freeways carved up neighborhoods there. Was there something particular about the freeways and its impact on the culture and the history of Los Angeles?
Great question. I think I would answer that by saying that my intention in that book was to, I think, disabuse the myth of the freeway as this objective fact of post-World War II urban development. The freeway is a concrete structure that was built by post-World War II generation of urban planners like Robert Moses, who were trained in planning schools, and they were trained essentially as scientists. I mean, they were trained as engineers, right? And the work of scientists and engineers is usually divorced from ideas about subjectivity, about bias, about all sorts of cultural issues. And freeways are often looked at as just a concrete fact of urban life. Our studies show that this location is the best place to build a freeway in order to connect X number of commuters with, Y number of jobs in another location, right? My purpose of that book was to say that was a myth. That's not the way freeways were built. Freeways were built according to the biases that shaped all sorts of segregation in American cities, not just racial segregation, but class segregation as well. And freeways were built using very biased data from the federal government. For example, the redlining maps of the 1930s and the studies of neighborhoods that were specifically intended to distinguish racial populations in cities in order to allocate federal funds for housing development in white neighborhoods, right? And freeway builders used that data in order to determine where to route freeways in cities. And the argument I take is that that was a cultural practice that implicated values, attitudes, beliefs about race, about racial hierarchy, about why certain neighborhoods were expendable and why other neighborhoods were, served by highway construction. That's one aspect of the book. The other aspect of the book is to say that there were also forms of resistance to highway construction from the communities that were considered to be expendable. And those forms of resistance also took a cultural shape. And that's because, for a lot of poor communities and poor communities of color in particular, culture is the most viable resource for expressing resistance, for expressing opposition. Historically, poor communities and poor communities of color lacked political capital, political connections. And unlike, certain neighborhoods like Beverly Hills, the people of Boyle Heights or South LA were essentially powerless to stop plans for highway construction. But nonetheless, they did create a cultural record of community opposition to highway construction. And the point of my book is to say, has anybody noticed this work? Has anybody noticed this body of cultural work that tells us that many communities were opposed to building highways in their neighborhoods, even though they were not able to stop the freeways? There's still a record of cultural resistance that needs to be acknowledged and addressed. And that's why I wrote that book.
Thanks, Eric. I
Well-
want to move toward wrapping up because we're getting pretty close to that 50-minute hour, but I also want to open it to Stan and to Mike. We did get a live fact check on the Spartacus date is 1960. So it's a little earlier than we thought. But and from Randy, who jumped in there and asked if that was if that would change the way we were talking about the film. If we want to talk about that, or Mike or Stan with any final questions. I know we could talk history and historiography, I think, all day. This is so rich in sort of modes of resistance. We've had a previous session on propaganda, and I don't know if there's any way of dislodging that idea of propaganda. It's so sort of saturated in terms of film and television. But sorry, Stan and Mike, any final?
One of the things you talked about was politics, and what I'm finding now, especially in the Inland Empire, those cities you mentioned earlier, Fontana and so on and so on. Fontana now has a black mayor, and so as politics changed, so I know in Rialto they had a lot of black politicians, an black assembly member from that area. And when they did do the freeway and did eliminate the black community, off-ramp in the black community, politicians actually got involved, and today they have an off-ramp in the black community. And so could you talk a little bit about how politics plays in the changes?
Well, I mean, I think that community activism has led to victories. Not total victories, of course, but starting in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the federal government began to implement changes in its practices, particularly regarding urban development, in order to mandate community input and environmental protection. And that was totally unprecedented because in the 1950s, they just bulldozed through communities, regardless of what people said. But the waves of activism that surfaced in 1960s America, reached the highest level of decision making in the federal government, and that changed the way that public projects were implemented in a way that enabled greater community input and mandated a form of listening to communities. And so those kinds of changes, I think, over time, is what led to certain victories that communities, Black and brown communities as well, in enforcing policy changes, such as the building of off-ramps in communities, or the removal of toxic waste dumps or incinerators. environmental activism is something that really took off in the late 70s and 1980s. And became a whole new frontier of community-based activism that combined racial forms of protest with environmental activism as well.
I just want to do one more thing, Mike, before I let go. I'd like your take on control of the media and how we as individuals see movies from our own perspective and so on. And I remember a movie that came out and it was actually limited to where it was released because of the content, was a movie called Mandingo. And I remember when I left that theater, I sat and watched the movie, and I left that theater, and as a black man, I was angry because the ending was just brutal. But what I also saw was not only me as a black man, but even white people that were at the movies left the movie with the same anger, and it was very interesting. So I think you're right. You're so right when you say we have our own perspectives on how we see things, no matter how the control is not necessarily control. It's what you take out of the movie yourself. So
yeah. Yeah, no, I could talk all day about the history of race in film. And there's, scores of books on that topic, but you could go from early 20th century films like Gone with the Wind and The Jazz Singer, and you could bring it current by talking about films like Moonlight or Get Out. And within that whole body of cinematic work, there are many different ways and messages about race, what race is, how race works, and different perspectives, white perspectives, black perspectives, and everything in between. But when we ask ourselves, where does race come from? Where do ideas about racial identity and racial hierarchy come from? You got to talk about film. There's just no way around it.
Thank you. You're muted, Mike.
Thanks very much, Eric. I really appreciate this discussion. And, if you can leave us with your favorite film noir movie, that'd be great.
That's a tough one. I guess I'd probably have to go to the 1970s, to what was called neo-noir. But Chinatown is a classic example. Blade Runner was a great rendition of the noir style. But if you want to go to the original period, I would maybe bring up Sunset Boulevard or Double Indemnity. All LA films, all great LA films, and classic examples of film noir.
Great list. Great list. Thank you for being here. I've really enjoyed this. Like you said, we could talk all day about the racism in films I just need to know. I'm going to read that book on by Carrie Williams, because I want to see a little bit more about the area that I live in, and so thank you for that too.
It's such a good book. It is the book that brought me into the study of LA history when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here. I hope we see you again, and I hope you do a book on the movies. Actually, on the movies, because I could talk forever on movies. I like a film noir, and I also like anything that brings people and cultures together. So thank you again.
Likewise, I'm with you on that 100%. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation, and again, thanks for the invitation. It's really it's quite gratifying to be able to talk with all of you.
Conversation on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University, San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Fall Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Tin Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yorba provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming, and find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, and Dorothy Roberts, and many more.